hint of life from the subject at all. They managed to succeed in stopping one of the most powerful kings from turning into an unwelcome variable in their plan. Hunter Seong's presence vanished just now. Can't you tell me what's going on? Thomas Andre, his wounds not even half healed yet, threw out a question. Leonard forced his unwilling lips to part. It was then. The two sovereigns walking leisurely over in Leonard's direction simultaneously looked behind them. Something impossible happened just then. From the body of the human whose heart was confirmed to be destroyed, they could hear vigorous, pounding heartbeats. But how? How could such a thing be possible? The two sovereigns exchanged disbelieving gazes with each other. And then, the absolute worst possibility entered their heads next. They had been overlooking this crucial fact until now. These two thought that, by killing the human host, they would also get to extinguish the shadow sovereign within, too. Just like how they themselves would die after taking over their hosts. However, their opponent this time was the king of the dead. There was no guarantee that death, supposed to treat everyone equally regardless of who, would be applied to him in the same manner. The end of one could also become the beginning for someone else. They had to stop this at all costs. They had to stop the descent of the true king via this fake death. Their expression turned utterly pale before they reacted almost instinctively. Two sovereigns instantly closed the distance to Jinwoo and reached out with their long claws and ice spear. In order to completely destroy the body that had acted as the tool of the king's descent, they poured in their entire magical energy into their weapons. Unfortunately, a figure hidden in stealth lightly landed on the ground before them, and his short swords blocked the claws and the ice spear quite ably. The Shadow Sovereign hadn't regained his consciousness yet. In that case, who could this being be? The two sovereigns couldn't hide their shock and fluster after their desperate attacks were defended against. The owner of the short swords undid his stealth and finally revealed himself. It was a figure cloaked in a hood. A pair of eyes gleaming in pure golden light were glaring at the sovereigns from below the hood. From here on, none shall touch this child. In another world, light and darkness existed in an age where nothing else yet existed. The Absolute Being split the light and created the emissaries of God. As for the darkness, it was split to create 8 sovereigns. Heeding the command issued during their birth, the sovereigns born to destroy worlds and the emissaries born to maintain the worlds began killing each other's soldiers over and over again. At the end of the lengthy war, fatigued by the constant and unending war, the most bright fragment of the brilliant light asked the Absolute Being, "O, our absolute ruler, why does thee not aid thy most faithful subjects fighting in thy honor? Why does thee ignore thy subjects' pain? Doth thee really not hear the screams of countless soldiers dying for thy honor? Aid us, lend us the strength to extinguish our opponents. We shall cut off their heads and offer them as the tribute to thy glory." However, the Absolute Being didn't reply back to the fragment. It was at that moment the fragments came to a realization, and that would be the truth of the battle between themselves and the sovereigns being nothing more than a form of entertainment to the Absolute Being, and that their ruler didn't wish for the battles to end. Now knowing that the war would never end as long as the Absolute Being continued to exist, the fragments fell into despair. The despair they felt transformed into rage, and rage soon morphed into hatred. To end this meaningless war, they unsheathed their blades. It was the start of the rebellion. Jinwoo witnessed the endless march of the soldiers spanning the cosmos itself. Oh my God! However, a group of soldiers suddenly appeared from the distance and blocked the march. The Shadow Sovereign next to Jinwoo pointed at the fragment of the brilliant light with 6 wings, standing in front of the blocking group. He was the sole emissary of God who stood up against the rebellion of the other emissaries. In the end, though, the pitiful number of soldiers he led powerlessly fell before the united armies of the emissaries. The fragment of the brilliant light never lost his absolute loyalty until the end. He died watching his brave subordinates get swept away by their enemies. He thought that this was the end. But when he reopened his eyes within the embrace of the darkness, he came to realize that the Absolute Being had hidden a certain power inside of him. For that eventuality when everything went wrong, the Absolute Being had hidden a truly fiendish power capable of ending everything, inside its most loyal slave. And so, floating within this endless abyss of darkness, the Sovereign of Death had finally opened his eyes towards his power. He tore off the remaining traces of his wings, all burnt away from the battle, and crafted brand new armor out of the surrounding darkness. Souls sleeping within this abyss heard the call and swore eternal allegiance to their new king. He led his brand new army and made his return. But when he finally came back, everything was already over. The remaining fragments of brilliant light had killed the Absolute Being and called themselves the new gods, thus assuming the position of the rulers. And using various tools containing the might of the Absolute Being, they hunted down the sovereigns. When the king of giants, the sovereign of the beginning, Rigia, was captured, the balance between the two sides collapsed and the remaining sovereigns realized the severity of the situation. It was at that moment that the Shadow Sovereign extended his hands to them. To combat their common enemy, every existing sovereign combined their forces, and in this manner, the war between 7 rulers and 9 sovereigns continued on, forever. The longer this war continued on, however, the greater the army of the Shadow Sovereign grew. Time was on his side. Thanks to his brilliant achievements, it seemed as if the victors of this long war would be the sovereigns. However, it wasn't only the rulers fearing the might of the Shadow Army that had grown, unbeknownst to all, to equal the army of destruction led by the King of Berserk Dragons. 2 sovereigns feared the Shadow Sovereign. The 2 of them were the Sovereign of White Flames and the Sovereign of Beastly Fangs. They aimed for the back of the former emissary just as the war was drawing to a close. It was at this point that Jinwoo got to witness again the scenes he saw within the save data back in the dual dungeon. The armies of demons and beasts joined hands with the armies of the rulers and pounced on the Shadow Sovereign and his army, and that resulted in him being driven to near annihilation. But then, the King of Beasts, the Sovereign of Beastly Fangs, ran away to save its own life, while forsaking its own soldiers. Meanwhile, the King of Demons, the Sovereign of White Flames, Baron, had to pay the ultimate price. The words Jinwoo couldn't understand. When he heard the words of the dying Baron, his eyes shook around really hard back then. And then, above his head, 4 angels with 6 wings slowly descended from the sky. That was where the video playback of the data Jinwoo watched came to an end. The 4 rulers soon surrounded the Shadow Sovereign, who no longer possessed enough strength to command his own shadow army. The Sovereign must have figured out what the inevitable result of this fight would be and discarded his sword to the ground. But if those rulers had killed the Shadow Sovereign back then, how could the existence of this Shadow Sovereign even be explained? Jinwoo swallowed his dry saliva and paid even closer attention to what could possibly be the end of the Shadow Sovereign. But then, the rulers began kneeling before the Shadow Sovereign one by one. And a short while later, the 6-winged angel kneeling in front raised his voice. The rulers were asking for forgiveness from the Shadow Sovereign. They occupied an overwhelmingly advantageous position. As long as they willed it, they could have sent the Shadow Sovereign back to the empty void, yet they wished to make up with him instead. This was their own way of showing their respect towards a comrade, born together at the same time, as well as the greatest warrior who once stood at the forefront with his army of brilliant light in the war against the powers of the sovereigns. Although the Shadow Sovereign was never their leader, his comrades nevertheless respected him greatly, and that was why they ignored the command from their leader, the brightest fragment of brilliant light, to get rid of the Sovereign and instead chose to kneel before him. The enraged voice of the Shadow Sovereign resounded throughout the land next. The Sovereign reached down and grabbed the collar of the ruler asking for forgiveness and yanked him up by force. The rulers maintained a courteous attitude, even towards the enraged Shadow Sovereign. Although they had to fight against him because of the differing ideals, they still hadn't forgotten about their admiration towards him in their hearts and consequently, they paid their utmost respect. The number of such soldiers utterly dominated the entire sky. And when all of them lowered their heads, the Shadow Sovereign stopped silently watching them and turned around to leave. The Sovereign of Death left the scene just like that, and afterwards, he completely vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, the combined forces of the Sovereigns, now that their own armies had been greatly depleted by the internal conflict of the 3 sovereigns, met with a resounding defeat at the hands of the rulers. The defeated remnants escaped to the crack between dimensions with their remaining forces. When the Shadow Sovereign and the Sovereign of Beastly Fangs ran into each other, others became extremely tense that another violent clash might take place. But due to the intervention from the Dragon Emperor, the feared event didn't come to pass. The Dragon Emperor then accepted the Shadow Sovereign back to their fold once more with open arms. So, this guy is the King of Berserk Dragons, the Sovereign of Destruction. The insane level of power oozing out from nothing more than just a glare even made Jinwoo's teeth clatter. Having evacuated to the crack between dimensions, the sovereigns avoided the ruler's detection and searched for a new world where they would nurture their army again. Countless galaxies and planets flew past Jinwoo's eyes, and eventually, the footage came to a stop right before a certain planet. Through their concerted efforts over a long period of time, the sovereigns succeeded in tunneling a portal from the crack between dimensions to Earth that existed in another dimension. And thanks to the entrance of unprecedented enemies, mankind couldn't avoid the fate of being annihilated. Jinwoo's expression hardened as he watched the cities get reduced to smoldering rubble, as first seen inside the demon's castle instant dungeon. Is this what will happen in the future? Jinwoo's eyes quaked powerfully from that unexpected answer, but his shock could linger around only for a short while, because the Shadow Sovereign continued on with his explanation. If the purpose of the sovereigns was to destroy, then the role of the rulers was to maintain the worlds. Naturally, the rulers grew angry at the fact that the thugs of the Chaos world they failed to eradicate the last time managed to bring down yet another world. In order to right the wrong, they resorted to activating a certain tool of God that they themselves had prohibited from use. The tool of God was called Chalice of Rebirth, an item they made sure to steal first as their top priority from God's storage, just before they started their rebellion. It was an incredible item that could reverse time by around 10 Earth years. 10 years. Jinwoo's eyes shot wide open. Could this be pure coincidence that the number of years matched the time when gates began generating out of thin air, and hunters appeared to stop them? The rulers did their best to rescue other worlds, but Earth was simply too fragile to host the battles between themselves and the sovereigns. This planet with no magical energy couldn't endure against the mass-scale battles. Didn't matter who won in the end between the rulers or the sovereigns, the result waiting for this planet remained the same. After going through several cycles of war and the destruction of the planet, the rulers came to a drastic decision. If saving everyone was impossible, then make sure that some would still survive and continue the life on this planet. If so, does that mean? Only then did Jinwoo finally realize it. He realized the reason why these rulers stayed behind the scenes and quietly let the process take place without getting in touch with humanity, even if they knew that there was a calamity coming. Humans capable of surviving in the changed world are. If humanity learned that everyone in the world would die soon with the sole exception of the small number of people referred to as hunters, would the human societies be able to function properly ever again? While the rulers busily tried to fix their mistakes several times, the sovereigns also began modifying their plan continuously as well, until the tool of God couldn't be used anymore. Hold up, are you telling me that there's a limit to this Chalice of Rebirth? There was a hint of this tangible bitterness in his voice, and that prompted Jinwoo to turn his head towards the Shadow Sovereign before he had time to even notice it. I'm asking you because it was brought up first, but how can creations kill the creator? Even if machines were created for the sake of humanity's convenience, they could still harm humans depending on how they were utilized. It was a similar sort of reason as to why humans feared artificial intelligence they themselves had created. Jinwoo nodded his head. Soon, the figures of several familiar sovereigns appeared around Jinwoo and the Shadow Sovereign, and that would be to copy the method of the rulers that lent the portions of their powers to various humans and had them kill monsters in order to spread magic energy throughout the planet. Sovereigns would also borrow the bodies of human hosts to descend on the world and bring their armies far earlier than what the rulers had been expecting, to devour the rulers' armies coming to aid humanity in one go. For a sovereign possessing incredible power to cross over into this world, it needed a host body. Sovereigns searched for and found suitable hosts for themselves one by one. However, only the two, the Sovereign of Destruction and the Shadow Sovereign, the possessors of two indescribably enormous powers, couldn't find human hosts with a physique that could handle their powers. The Architect. This wizard, referred to as the Architect by the Sovereigns, promised to aid the Shadow Sovereign's descent to this world for the price of turning him into a true immortal. Since he was already somewhat interested in the ongoings of the human world, the Shadow Sovereign agreed to this offer. Unfortunately, no human alive could handle the power of death. Obviously, the Architect became rather anxious as time ticked by. While the Architect was sweating buckets trying to locate suitable candidates, the Shadow Sovereign actually went ahead and found himself a potential host first. Jinwoo raised his head, as if there were hundreds of monitors displaying all sorts of varied and colorful images of him. His past self doing various things appeared in all directions. He had been working as a hunter for 4 years. Jinwoo was ranked E, not only that, at the bottom of the lowest rank, too. Yet, despite experiencing the life-threatening dangers of dungeons every day, he didn't stop entering them. It was all for the sake of his mother and his little sister. He sacrificed himself for his family and desperately struggled on. The records of the past 4 years were all preserved in their entirety within the Shadow Sovereign's memories. The Shadow Sovereign was now pointing at Jinwoo, and seeing that unwavering finger, he felt his heart race faster and faster. The Sovereign did say it before, didn't he? I am the record of your bitter struggle. I am the evidence of your resistance. I am the reward of your pain. Those words weren't describing Jinwoo's life after he had become a player. No, it was about his life before he got to enjoy the benefit of the system. Every one of those words rang weightily within his chest once more. The dual dungeon, the test of his survival, and then the player. All of these were part of the plan of the architect to create a suitable vessel for the Shadow Sovereign. What humans enjoyed playing and were also good at, he said. Jinwoo knew right away what that thing was as soon as he heard the Sovereign. It was none other than video games. Here was the reason why the system designed to manage the player possessed such a similar layout to a video game. And Jinwoo was the lone successful case among all the test subjects. But then, you betrayed the architect, didn't you? Jinwoo recalled the sight of the angel statue jumping up and down in fury while busily crying out that the other sovereigns had been deceived back inside the second dual dungeon. The puzzling thing was, why did the Shadow Sovereign deceive the one he was in contract with, and choose Jinwoo instead? He simply had to ask for clarification here. But why? For the first time ever, the Shadow Sovereign hesitated. He looked to be agonizing over something, and Jinwoo didn't press him for an immediate answer. Eventually, the Sovereign opened his mouth again. Compared to how lengthy his deliberation was, that answer was way too simple. Strangely enough, Jinwoo couldn't hold back his chuckle, though. Rather than erasing Jinwoo's ego and taking over his body, the Shadow Sovereign had chosen to assimilate with him instead. Meaning, he chose to become a part of him. And the end result was, the Shadow Sovereign possessed the exact same face as him. I am you. That was the undeniable truth, with not an ounce of falsehood within. The Shadow Sovereign lowered his left hand, raised the right one instead. In an instant, all those faces disappeared, only to be replaced by a humongous dragon flying in from the darkened sky high above. And then, an army entirely consisting of countless dragons following after it to incinerate every city they could find. Jinwoo stared at the army of destruction led by the Dragon Emperor with a hardened face before making his reply. No, he asked a question instead. Why did you run away to another world with the other sovereigns when you had no desire to fight against the rulers? The Shadow Sovereign was a ruler and at the same time, a sovereign. And he couldn't find the place he could call home with either group. That was why he chose to wander in other worlds he was not originally a part of, hoping to find his place. Hearing the Sovereign's answer, Jinwoo finally made his decision. My answer is the same. An imperceptible smile had already floated up on the Sovereign's face even before Jinwoo made his reply. This is not where I belong. The Shadow Sovereign nodded, saying, Does this mean I won't ever get to see you again? Despite saying those words, there was the look of a relieved man on the Sovereign's face. Finally, the time of rest had come after an eternity of waiting. Jinwoo watched the Sovereign genuinely feeling happy for himself and bade his last goodbye. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. For a brief moment there, a look of wistful longing brushed past the Sovereign's expression before disappearing altogether. Jinwoo stopped him there. I know, because I am you. A smile floated up on the Shadow Sovereign's face as the time of departure drew near. After a long journey, he had reached a place he could rest now. The Sovereign addressed Jinwoo. He took a step back and wordlessly stared at Jinwoo, nodding his head. 2 words that would allow him to be reborn as the perfect Shadow Sovereign left his lips in a low, hushed voice. Rise up. The system's familiar female voice rang in his head the moment Jinwoo uttered rise up. Jinwoo was now bestowed with the true power of the Shadow Sovereign, which meant that the system was now rendered irrelevant to him. So, it began deleting itself. He felt as if he was saying goodbye to a nanny that looked after him since his childhood. Goodbye, my king. I pray that you find the peaceful rest you dearly wished for so long in the land of eternal sleep. Finally, even the system message signifying farewell popped up. 2 icons of yes and no blinked in the empty air. Jinwoo shifted his gaze, one last time, to the Shadow Sovereign. Even until the end, the former angel hadn't lost that content smile of his, because that would be the lasting image engraved in his heart, after all. That was why Jinwoo also smiled back. With a smile, he issued his final input to the system. Yes, a powerful wind pressure being generated